Okay, so we tend to think of education in terms of institutions. In literary studies, this is marked by a divide between the literary scholar or critic, academic, and the autodidact, so the person out in the real world. This always makes me think of John Guillory's warning that literary studies is becoming an increasingly inward-turning profession. So if the problem is that it's inward turning, it follows that the solution would be to turn outwards. So to stop thinking of the study of literature or how literature should be studied as confined to the guarded domain of the academic. But then this also opens up the question, what would turning outward look like when it comes to the study of literature? My interest in this began with thinking critically about education and the discipline. The rabbit hole this took me down led me to Franz Kafka. Oops, sorry. There we go. 2024 marked the 100-year anniversary of Kafka's death. It was also the year that he entered into the media and public record as, in the words of Erica Nardozzi, an unlikely heartthrob on TikTok, whose popularity was on par with celebrities like Harry Styles. By June last year, hashtag Franz Kafka had been tagged on 193 million posts on TikTok. In the last 30 days alone, as of 9 o'clock this morning, posts about Kafka have been interacted with 1.3 million times. This was understandably met with confusion. I was confused. The man was not particularly attractive, he was deeply troubled, and he's dead. The obsession became even more confusing when social media users started claiming him as a boyfriend superior to the men that they encountered in everyday life. But the fixation on Kafka had nothing to do with parasocial attraction. These young people, many in their teens and early 20s, are reading his works, they're falling in love with his letters to Milena, and they're finding meaning in the metamorphosis. They're part of an online reading community that primarily celebrates the works of Kafka, Camus, and Dostoevsky on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, or rather BookTok, Bookstagram, and BookTube. This arose a little bit out of the COVID-19 pandemic, which changed the reading habits of millions, reflected in the growth of this particular subsection of TikTok as well. As Derek Attridge observes in Criticism Today, countless homes have become sites of literary encounters. At the same time, Attridge complains that it's likely that only a small percentage of books being read would count as great literature, or even as inventive rather than formulaic literary works. And it's true that a large section of BookTok and Bookstagram is dedicated to popular fiction, romance novels in particular. But content creators recommending romance novels by authors like Pauline Hoover are often also suggesting works by authors of what Attridge would class as great literature, like Kafka. Many of these content creators are not literary scholars. This is Trish Parkinson. She's pictured here giving her opinions on Woolf's A Room of One's Own and Hannah Grace's awful romance novel, Icebreaker. Trish is not a literary scholar. She's in her early 20s. She's doing her master's in speech-language pathology. I contacted her to get her opinion on BookTok, and when asked about her reading habits as someone who reads popular and canonical fiction, this was her response. I read classic fiction because I believe it's foundational to the books we have today. Many of the tropes I love in modern fiction can be traced back to classic works. These authors' works are also important to preserve as they give us valuable insights into history. I enjoyed breaking down the text and extracting deeper meaning, this in a literature class. To me, reading should always be a way to learn and grow. I also love reading popular fiction because it's a great way to unwind. After a long day of school, I often crave something entertaining and fun. For me, reading is the perfect hobby because it can both educate and entertain. There are countless content creators who read across the literary spectrum and talk about their reading on social media. And judging by the comments on their videos, the audiences are doing the same. Trish's TikTok account is a drop in the ocean. the Yale Daily News reported in October last year that hashtag BookTok had been tagged on 36 million TikTok videos that accumulated more than 200 billion views. Those stats haven't come in for the rest of the year, but I think it's safe to assume that they're much higher. According to TikTok, the BookTok community, the sub-community, is one of the largest on the platforms, and the community centered on Kafka is large enough to have attracted a fair bit of media coverage. It has also sparked a lot of anxiety in literary critics and authors who are more concerned about how Kafka is being read rather than the fact that it's being read. This is Seth Rogoff, and he believes that he and other misanthropic defenders of a lost age are on the front lines of a war to rescue Kafka from what he calls a vacuous culture set on reducing the author to a figure for memes. Kafka, he says, cannot possibly withstand the flattening and empty forces of social media. Judging by his concerns, Rogoff has not spent much time in the Kafka community on social media. If he did, he would see that for the most part, they take Kafka as seriously as he does. When memes cross the line into kind of silly territory, commenters will preface any enjoyment of the content with a disclaimer that it's cursed or that Kafka wouldn't have approved. At the same time, humor and enjoyment are a big part of what brings these communities together. I'm going to share a little bit of that silly joy with you now. So if you ever wanted to know what Kafka would be doing on TikTok, you have your answer. The average Kafka meme is a lot more nuanced, sometimes darkly satirical. If we use the metamorphosis as an example, the most common memes depict interpretations of the text ranging from critiques of capitalism and wage slavery to reflections on the alienating and damaging effects of social pressure, patriarchy, and capitalism on women. As Amanda Hess wrote for the New York Times, telling the internet that Harry Styles is your boyfriend is a fantasy. Telling the internet that Franz Kafka is your boyfriend, that is a thesis statement. These are not vacuous, reductive, or empty readings of the novel. What the alleged offenders of a lost age seem to be missing is that simplifying a complex idea into an image or short clip that successfully conveys meaning to a very wide, very diverse audience is not easy. The creator needs to have a firm grasp on popular culture and a deep critical understanding of the novel and how it speaks to contemporary society, and so does their audience. Content creators and their audiences span platforms. The affordances and limitations of each platform dictates the kind of content created with a bit of crossover. So Reels on TikTok will often find their way to Instagram or YouTube Shorts. Subcommunities on social media are informal and unstructured and interact with literature through memes, short videos, images, and video essays. Interaction can be generative, so making content, passive, viewing content, or interactive. That's reposting content, commenting on it, and talking to others in threads, including the content creator. There are also apps like Fable, which invites users to join a community of good people to discuss great stories. Readers can join a group reading a particular book. They can also create groups and participate in discussion forums. These are informal but structured reading communities, and they're specifically designed to facilitate the discussion of literature, set reading goals, and track reading habits. The appeal of engaging with literature in these ways aligns with Andrew Piper's view that although we largely read in isolation, we still wish for commonality when it comes to reading. He identifies three intersecting ideas that sort of perfectly illustrate what brings these bookish communities together. We have commonality. We want other people to read the same thing we're reading. Transferability. We want to be able to send other people what we are reading. And sociability. We want to be able to talk to other people about what we are reading. Online spaces, structured and unstructured, bring together readers of different ages from different educational backgrounds, cultural and economic backgrounds to consume, share, learn, and talk about literature. And this includes complex canonical literature. They're enjoying it, they're understanding it, they're talking about it. On social media, readers with and without backgrounds in literary studies are placed on equal footing in unconventional, informal educational spaces that encourage reading curiosity and exploration. This, however, stands in strong contrast to the formal English literary classroom, which should be a space where an interest in exploring and talking about literature is commonplace. But instead, what we've been noticing more and more is that students are more focused on grades than learning or reading. Undergraduates effectively enter the academy as amateur readers, like those who make up I can't say that word today, bookish communities online. This means that they also bring with them the same skills, the ability to critically engage with literature in the interesting ways that their counterparts on TikTok, for example, are engaging with literature and even complex literature. So the question is then, where does it all go when they enter the classroom? If we recognize that students enter the academy as amateur readers, it's useful to understand how amateur readers, like those that make up bookish communities, understand themselves in relation to the formal study of literature and literary critics and academics, the same literary critics and academics who grade their work and teach them. Dorothy Burke's findings in her study of BookTube are quite useful here. She writes that booktubers tend to see criticism and reviewing as gatekeeping activities, as jobs that entail exclusivity in two senses. They're reserved for people with a particular kind of education and training, and they're about pronouncing authoritative judgments of quality. Many booktubers value inclusivity and low thresholds. She goes on to cite Jim Collins' observation that the rise of popular literary culture in the past 3 decades entailed discrediting of the academy and empowering amateur readers. So this is not, as pearl-clutching academics or intellectuals like Rogoff would have us believe, a turn to anti-intellectualism. Rather, it usefully highlights some of the problems that we're facing in literary studies. To return to John Guillory, he's identified growing uncertainty amongst academics and literary critics about the relevance and social effects of the discipline, and the growing gap between academics and common readers. Literary criticism that employs a lexicon well outside the understanding of the average reader can be alienating. Just because a student is enrolled in a university does not mean that they automatically become literary experts. They are effectively, until much later in their careers, common readers. So unlike readers outside of the academy, students enter into their programs with the understanding that they will become experts as they progress in their studies. Whether or not they are successful is determined not by how well they read, but how well they perform in exams, or more commonly, the university essay. Students, as amateur readers, perceiving an equality between themselves and their lecturers, are subscribing to the idea that they don't have the specialist skills that they need to read, that there is a right and a wrong way to read a text, a singular interpretation that needs to be uncovered, and a right and a wrong answer to a question. The goal is to learn to imitate the lexicon, not read the text. So they go away and they do the prescribed reading, or rather, I think has become more common, they read summaries and attend lectures where they listen to an authoritative interpretation of the text. They then repeat what they've been told in an essay or exam. The seminar is supposed to be a space that encourages discussion, but if students are only reading summaries, that discussion is not going to be very in-depth. Some students don't want to engage, they might be too shy, or they aren't sure enough of themselves. And if discussion is productive and interesting, those same ideas often don't make their way into the academic essay. So given all of this, students, especially struggling students who are prioritizing the essay and grades, tend to turn to AI to generate their work, and this is increasingly becoming a problem. So GPTs like ChatGPT and Jenny SAI are advertised as a way, and they really are advertised this way, to level the playing field by promising an easy route to a top grade. And technology is advancing at such a rapid rate at this point that GPTs like Cite can generate essays with citations. If it looks a little too robotic, you can run it through undetectable AI, where you click the humanize button and it makes it seem a little more human. So what this means for lecturers and for literary studies is that it's more important than ever for us to start adapting to student needs in a way that empowers them, but without compromising the integrity of the discipline. And one of the ways we can meet these challenges is to find ways to activate the need for commonality, transferability, and sociability that drives reading and the will to learn found in communities online. There are several aspects of BookTok, BookTube, and Bookstagram that translate well into the study of literature. So social reading, annotation, and the foregrounding of how a reader responds to a text. On social media, annotation is becoming a lot more popular. There are read with me videos, and they're combined with longer formats on YouTube or longer essays on YouTube, showing readers how to annotate together and how to get started on that. In literary studies, and this is something you will now be familiar with thanks to Dr. Gordon's presentation, tools like hypothesis can be used to center the text and cultivate reading communities. And this is also a way of cultivating accessible education spaces. So what hypothesis does in a lot of ways is to emulate the inclusivity and freedom of expression on social media platforms. I was introduced to this pedagogy by Dr. Gordon. I incorporated social annotation using hypothesis into my third-year undergraduate seminar.
Carrie, can we just say 5 more minutes to go? Is that okay? That give you enough time?
Yeah, that should be
Great.
good. I incorporated this into my third-year undergraduate seminar, which required students to read very sort of high modernist novels. And the class annotated Patrick Suskind's The Pigeon together, which, like Kafka's Metamorphosis, is kind of absurd, offbeat, full of existential dread, which students seem to like. The social annotation assignment, which took the place of the essay, foregrounds reading. So students were required to annotate the text together. They documented their ideas as the novel progressed, and this forced them to foreground their own ideas, to trust their instincts, instead of defaulting to study guides. This was then supplemented by in-class discussion of The Pigeon and other texts. So their comments and observations and the ease with which they were interacting, a bit of a process. They started out a bit uncertain, but they got there. It wasn't dissimilar to interactions between readers on apps like Fable, which is what initially got me thinking about whether or not there were other similarities, why students connected with this particular pedagogy. So in the same way that bookish communities have claimed sections of social media, the students claimed the annotation space as their own. They were commenting on each other's ideas, they argued productively, they corrected each other, they were encouraging, they challenged each other. But if a student tried to introduce something, and if AI generated, plagiarized, it was out of place. And other students didn't really want to interact with it. So it became clear quite early on that if students wanted to interact or wanted their peers to interact with them, they had to do so authentically. And this falls in line with attitudes to plagiarism in bookish communities. Earlier this year, Medium reported that Bookstagram is very anti-AI because of how it's affecting the publishing industry. But more importantly, they value authenticity in content creation, and AI is not authentic. Students' resistance to plagiarized annotations was a resistance to inauthenticity because it got in the way of genuine engagement and conversation and enjoyment of the text. And the confidence they gained here carried over into the classroom. It was great to see students who were previously not very active become more active. They became a community of readers. At the end of the seminar, they filled out a course evaluation. They were asked a general question with no prompting about annotation, which was what was the most valuable part of the course. 100% of them said social annotation. And what is particularly interesting is the trends in what students organically identified as helpful about approaching a text in this way, and how they situated it within their broader experiences of studying literature over the course of their undergraduate careers. Just going to give you a few quotes. One student said, "Due to annotating, my understanding of the novels was much better than writing an essay. My views were expressed more vocally and appreciated." Another wrote, "Normally we are left on our own to read a novel or novella and then write an essay on just one aspect of it. When annotating, you have to pay attention to every little detail, which in turn highlights things that would otherwise be missed. I felt like I engaged more in this course than ever before and really understood the depth of the novellas. It allowed us peers to engage with each other compared to just keeping our ideas to ourselves." And finally, having to annotate forced me to try to critically analyze the texts and therefore understand them in a way I do not think I could have had I not done the annotations. Seeing and responding to other people's annotations also helped me to understand things from a different perspective and gave insight into ideas I had not thought of. They felt empowered by the same aspects of annotation that unite bookish communities. They enjoyed reading together, they enjoyed peer engagement, feeling heard, being exposed to different perspectives, and having their ideas validated or productively challenged, which allowed them to engage more freely and closely with the novels and to enjoy that process. They also identified the deficits in traditional assessments, including that when writing essays, they felt isolated, they did not feel confident expressing their own views, and did not typically engage in critical analysis, which is what we want them to do. They also limited themselves to narrow readings of the text. This course example is one of many. I've incorporated social annotation into other courses with the same or similar results. The annotation process with a focus on reading in community breaks students out of the idea that literary criticism is reserved for those who already have a particular kind of education and training. Students stop trying to emulate an academic authority and became authoritative voices. So like their counterparts in the Kafka community, they felt they had permission to read. And at the end of the course, they asked for another text to be added. An additional one, we had to add extra classes so that they could continue to annotate and read together. So they had become, in short, a community of readers. Thank you.